Hi, Jane. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm
Good.
excited for this. We are going to be starting a bit of a series on some chats and talks amongst the Acuity team. We often get asked the question of where do I start? Where do I start with something? And today's where do I start topic is about leadership. So quite oftentimes people are entering or embarking on leadership positions at different phases in their careers. And sometimes it was planned, sometimes it was very thought out and they anticipated it. Other times it came completely out of the blue and they have no idea where to start, what to do. So we thought it would be helpful to have a conversation for leaders on what are some of the most important things that they should be doing right off the bat. And so I'm going to talk to Jane and dig in a little bit about that. But just before we do, Jane and I are both partners at Acuity HR Solutions here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And we have a team here. Our office is out of the Exchange. Many of our team members are currently working remotely, although we do pop in and out of the office here and there. And we've worked with a number of different organizations in Winnipeg, but across Canada as well too. So we love to impact our organizations and support them across the board when it comes to training and HR consulting projects, workplace investigations, recruitment, whole host of different things. So if you want to learn more about us, you can visit www.acuityhr.ca. But without further ado, let's get into this, Jane. So when we mentioned this topic, what came to mind for you first as something that if a new leader was wondering where to start, what do they do?
So yeah, there were sort of three things that popped in my head when you brought this topic up a couple of days ago, and we talked about doing this. The first one was how important it is for leaders to make time to lead. Anybody who's done any sort of training with me or with Acuity in the past, any sort of leadership training has probably heard me talk about this before. I talk about it all the time. But I think it's incredibly important for leaders to tackle leadership like they would any other major deliverable or item on their plate. And I put time aside in my calendar for every other big thing I have on my plate. And so I need to also set time aside to think about my team and what my team needs from me and what I need to be trying and doing differently. You know, we know that great leaders typically reflect and they experiment on what's working and what's not working. And some of us do that a little bit more naturally. Some of us don't. I'm the kind of person that probably needs to set that time aside a little bit to make sure I sit down and think about it. So I really encourage leaders to make time to lead, to do that maybe on a weekly basis, especially if you're a new leader and you want to get into that habit. And really, this is about recognizing that when you become a leader, you know, leadership isn't something you do off the side of your desk when you have time. It's your job now, right? So you don't just do it when there's an emergency, when there's a fire. It's now your biggest responsibility. And so you got to set some time aside and be really intentional and deliberate.
So what would you say the pitfall would be if someone doesn't set time aside? Because you mentioned how it can be, you can feel like there's emergencies happening and other things going on, and it's kind of a side of the desk thing that you're dealing with. You've got so much else on your plate, and we hear it all the time where they just go, clients say, or leaders say, I just don't have time. How can I carve out extra time? What would be the pitfalls if somebody doesn't make that time?
I think the biggest pitfall is we just end up being reactive, right? We end up being reactive. We end up being less prepared. We find that more emergencies pop up because we're being reactive, because we don't see things coming. We don't take that time to notice that, oh, hey, this person has hit a milestone. Who are they? What do they need? And how am I going to recognize that milestone? And do it before they get annoyed that we missed the milestone and didn't recognize it at all, right? So I think that, you know, short term, it's hard to find that time. I get that. Short term, it's hard to find the time. But long term, if it means 6 months from now or a year from now, your team is firing on all cylinders, right? They're getting stuff done and they're having a good time while they do it. You're going to be really glad that you invested that time now off the top.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you're definitely planning for the future. You're not just planning for the right then and there. And like you said, you're not just being reactive. And I think it's important to ensure that as a leader, you're making efficiencies along the way, because if you've come into a new leadership position very suddenly and you're there to clean up a bit of a mess, then you need all of the efficiencies that you can find and get, and supporting your people is definitely one of those top priorities.
I kind of liken it to, you often hear people talk to entrepreneurs about making sure, or business leaders, making sure that they're not just working in their business, they're working on their business.
Mm-hmm.
Making time to lead is making sure you're not just working in your team in the day-to-day, but you're working on your team and where you want to go.
Absolutely. And that can be hard too if someone has come from like a doer sort of role or more of a frontline position and now they're the leader, kind of understanding that shift and taking away that temptation to just kind of revert back to doing the day-to-day.
Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest traps we've all felt at some point. And many of us will have felt that, right? We're a really strong doer. And so when we move into a new role, we tend to want to go back to sometimes what we're really comfortable with, which is the doing. And then we forget to focus on some of these other things. So this really, that making time to lead really forces us to make sure we keep it a priority.
Yeah. And you said on a weekly basis, how long should somebody spend if they're just starting out? Let's say they're newly into a leadership role, they're kind of planning out their first month. So in the first 4 weeks, how much time should they be expecting for this sort of making time and planning?
Most leaders I work with, I recommend that they spend about 30 minutes a week, that they put a recurring calendar invite in their calendar every week. You know, a lot of leaders like to do it on Monday morning, sort of plan for the week ahead. A lot of leaders like to do it at the end of the week, to think about the past week and plan for the next week. If somebody has trouble sort of setting that time aside, I always think about stacking habits. So if you have another meeting that happens every week, like for instance, our team at Acuity, right? We have our weekly Tuesday meeting as a whole team. I might decide to take that 30 minutes right before or right after because I'm attaching it to something that's already a habit in my calendar. So that can help people get started as well. But, you know, I would say every week, and the time you need probably depends a little bit on the size of your team too, right? Like if you're a leader of one person, you're probably not taking quite as much time as a person who has 10 people on their team that has a lot to think about in terms of dynamics and, you know, who's doing really well, who's struggling, how am I, helping this person grow where this other person, how am I helping them maintain where they're at because they're doing really great. If you have a lot of people, you probably need a little bit more time.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Okay, so making time to lead, and what, like in that 30 minutes, maybe lay out a little bit about what that time could be spent doing, like in terms of that planning. What does that look like?
So I'd say there's a few primary things that I would be thinking about. And this making time to lead, it's really important to make the distinction that it is time for you as a leader to reflect. So it's, sometimes leaders think it's about like meeting one-on-one with each person on their staff or something, which I think you should also do on a regular basis. But this time really is just for you to think about your team. And so what I would be thinking about is, where's the dynamic of my team today? Like what's working, what's not working? Mm-hmm. Maybe thinking about where I want it to be, what that sort of aspiration is. And so I might do that on a group level, and then I'd also do it on an individual level. I'd probably be thinking through who's knocking it out of the park. How am I making sure that they are getting recognition, that they see that I see them doing that great work? Who on the team is struggling? How am I checking in? What are the steps that we're taking there? I might think about, is there a tough conversation that I've been putting off, right? Maybe I have somebody who's been really snappy lately with their coworkers or something like that, and it's getting to the point where I'm like, oh, I have to say something. Yeah. So is there a conversation that I need to have? And then another thing I might think about is, if I'm finding it really hard to make time to lead, what can I delegate? Mm-hmm. What do I have on my plate that could be someone else? And maybe even somebody on my team would do it better than I would. But I might need to look for some opportunities to delegate, find some more time for myself. We can delegate a lot of the things we have on our plate. The one thing as leaders we cannot delegate is leading. So that's on your plate. So what else can you delegate so that you can give the time and attention you need to really lead your team and help your team thrive?
Awesome. No, that's huge. I think that's, the whole making time to lead concept is something we talk a lot about. And I think it's really integral to, for people to understand that making that time is not just with the individual team members. It's like you said, it's your planning time. It's your think time. It's your understanding what needs to get done for your team. So awesome. Okay. What else? What else should leaders think about if they're newly embarking on a leadership position? Where do they start?
For sure. So number one, make time to lead. Number two is an interesting one. I would say number two is to focus on asking questions and listening more than answering questions and talking. I think that sometimes when we move into a new role, whether it's with a new company or just, a different spot within an organization, we have this temptation to want to demonstrate and show what we know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes when we try and demonstrate and show what we know through talking and just sharing off all of our expertise, I actually think we sometimes put our foot in our mouths and it kind of backfires. And one of the best ways that we can both build relationships with people and build credibility is to just ask really good questions and listen, right? So we're moving into this new leadership role, and it's okay. What don't I know? Like what are you seeing? What have you been seeing that I haven't seen because I'm new here? Really understanding your team, letting them share their ideas, their thoughts, getting to know them, as opposed to demonstrating what you know.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the best ways to build credibility is actually by asking very good questions. So you're still demonstrating your expertise if you're asking the right questions, but you're giving your team an opportunity to engage, and you're making sure you don't put your foot in your mouth by saying like, here's my 5-point plan for how we're going to deal with all this stuff. Meanwhile, we don't have all the details, and people are looking at it going, like, that plan doesn't make sense. Like, based on how we do business and these factors, you didn't even ask us. You don't know that makes sense. So 1, make time to lead. 2, ask questions.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay.
The third one, I would say, and I've been thinking about this one a little bit. There were a few different ways I could go with this one. The first 2 things that I thought a leader could do came to me very easily. The third one I've been thinking a little bit more about. I think the third one is to really know yourself. To, as you get into this role, understand who you are, what you do well, what you don't do well, what you need to work on, and where you're maybe going to need to check yourself. Mm-hmm. Because being a leader is different than being a part of a team. You're held to a higher standard. And it's important that you know your team and you get to know them very well, but you also got to know yourself, right? And one of the examples that we've talked about, and Jaysa, you brought this up at another point today, was we talk on our team about speak to think versus think to speak, right? We talk about how, both you and I fall a little bit more on the speak to think side of things. We have people on our team that fall a little bit more on the think to speak side of things. And so both you and I are quick to share and talk a lot. Me in particular. And then we have people on our team who they're going to sit in the background, and unless somebody says, hey, what do you think? They might not share quite as much.
Yeah.
So I got to know myself to know I am that speak to thinker, and to recognize when I'm in those situations where I need to sit back and listen. Mm-hmm. And if I'm honest with myself, that's like a constant, everyday, ongoing process. And something I know I have to work on all the time. But as a new leader, like, what are those things that are your stumbling blocks, right? Yeah. That that if you don't check them a little bit, it may not land well. And what we know is often the things that make us really great at something, the things that are our biggest strengths, our biggest talents, also can be our Achilles heel a little bit. Right? So I'm lucky. My job is talking. It's training. It's facilitating. And that's a great thing. And that's what makes me good at that job. But in certain situations, it's my weakness because I don't listen as well as I could have. Right? So I think knowing yourself is going to be really important.
So when someone's identifying, let's say, a strength of theirs and also identifying a weakness, how do they, as a leader, kind of quickly leverage the strength and work with the weakness?
Yeah. So, leveraging the strength is really thinking about like where and how you can use that, right? Like, we all have things that are really special about us that are probably unique. We all have things that we bring to a team or to a scenario that are unique and different that maybe nobody else is bringing to that team or scenario. So to understand those things, understand what we bring, and then look for opportunities to really bring it. From a weakness perspective, part of it is around understanding, is this a weakness that I can work on and do a bit better at? But also understanding if it's a weakness that, like, you don't have to be great at that thing. And so it's a question of, like, is there somebody else that's going to be really good at that thing, right? This doesn't necessarily relate to the leadership side of things, but I always think about me and like Excel and data. I'm not a data manager. I don't see big swaths of information and go like, ooh, I know how I can organize that and make it make sense. But we know Devin on our team is really strong at that. So I can leverage her as a complementary partner. So when I'm thinking about strengths and weaknesses, I'm thinking about, okay, what do I really want to lean into?
Yeah.
And in the weakness side of things, what are the things that I can either work around or I can find a system for, like using my calendar a certain way if I'm not great at managing my time?
Yeah.
Or is there a complementary partner that I can leverage who really likes that other thing, who's really good at it, so that I don't have to stress out about that weakness, where that weakness becomes a little bit less relevant because I can rely on somebody else for it.
Exactly. Well, and the best part too, I think, in a leadership scenario is you have more control over where and when and how, and you can kind of leverage and delegate as you need. But again, like you said, it's about going back to knowing yourself and understanding that first and foremost, so that you can kind of figure out who is best at what, and is it you or is it someone else on your team? And that's okay, because like you said, you don't have to know everything. And I'm sure that's certainly a pitfall that not all leaders are willing to admit, but sometimes feel as though going into a scenario they have to assert that all-knowing image. So
it can be, I think, extremely freeing as a team member or as a leader to be able to just be like, man, that is super not my thing.
Yeah.
And to be able to just know it, right? And
yeah.
When you're leveraging somebody else to help with those things, it is really important to make sure that it is something that they have the skill set for and is a strength for them, that we're not just downloading something hard for us to somebody else that is also going to find it equally as hard, because that's not really the point. But yeah, like it's a freeing thing to, even as a team, right, determine like, what is everybody good at? Where does everybody really shine? How can we help them do more of what they shine at, and do less of the things that are draining for them?
Absolutely. So quick recap, the top 3 that you've chatted about.
So make time to lead every week, set time aside in your calendar, recurring meeting invite to sit down, think about your team, where you want to go. We don't just magically reach our people goals. We have to work at them just like every other goal we have on our plate. So make time to lead, ask questions more than you speak when you start out as a leader, and then know yourself. Know who you are, what you do well, what you struggle with, and find ways to work around some of those weaknesses and really lean into your strengths.
Awesome. Well, thanks for anyone who is tuned in to kind of watch this conversation. Again, this has kind of been a where do I start, and where do I start when I'm new to a leadership position.